Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to lie down in your own coffin, alive, while strangers stood over you, calling it healing? Imagine the sound of wood groaning beneath your weight, the smell of pine sap seeping into your skin, the lid resting close enough that you could picture it sealing shut forever. This wasn't a nightmare. It was real. In a city drowning in fever and whispers, patients seeking hope were given coffins instead of beds. And nobody spoke of it, because those who didn't last long. Why was this buried? Why were voices silenced? And most terrifying of all, what did the hospital really gain from treating the living as though they were already dead? In 1902, the streets of New Orleans hummed with a strange duality. On one side, life pulsed in rhythm with the brass bands, parades, and the intoxicating chaos of the French Quarter. On the other, shadows lengthened across the city as whispers of fever, poverty, and unexplainable deaths spread like smoke. Against this backdrop, a hospital rose, not grand in size, but formidable in reputation. To the desperate, it promised care and survival. To the elite who funded it, it promised control and experimentation. And within its walls, the sick were not laid upon beds. They were placed in coffins. The first reports seemed so absurd that newspapers ignored them, dismissing the talk as urban folklore. But the survivors' testimonies repeated the same detail again and again. Upon arrival, patients were shown to long wooden boxes. There was no straw mattress, no metal frame, nothing resembling the comfort of a bed. Instead, the patient was guided, sometimes carried, into a coffin, lined with rough cloth, its smell pungent with sap and varnish. The lid was rarely closed completely, but the mere presence of it hovering near gave the sense that death lingered. Close, waiting. To the doctors who ran the place, this was framed as a method of healing. They claimed the coffin aligned the body with the natural position of death, which in their twisted theory encouraged the body to relax, to release tension, and to allow fevers to pass. They spoke with authority, cloaking cruelty in the language of science. Patients were told that lying as the dead lie would restore their balance, draw poisons downward, and remind them that survival required submission. For the poor of New Orleans, who had seen family after family devastated by yellow fever, cholera, and tuberculosis, this explanation was strange, but not beyond belief. They were a people surrounded by death. Coffins were not abstractions, but daily realities, carved and carried through the narrow streets. Perhaps, they reasoned, these doctors had discovered a truth others had overlooked. In their desperation, hope made the unnatural seem acceptable. But inside those walls, the reality was harsher than any rumor. Patients remembered the hollow sound each time they shifted their weight, the echo of wood beneath their backs. The air carried a heavy, resinous scent that clung to their clothes. Nights were filled with unsettling noises, groans from weakened bodies, scratching from restless neighbors, sudden thuds when someone tried to push against the lid. The silence of the nurses made it worse. They moved like specters, speaking little, gliding between coffins as though presiding over a morgue rather than a ward. One survivor, whose account was smuggled out years later, recalled how the doctors would tap on the lids during inspection rounds. A sharp rap, as if testing whether the wood had been properly sealed. The patients were instructed to lie still, to breathe slowly, and to resist panic. Any sign of agitation brought punishment, injections that dulled the senses, or restraints that bound the arms. It was less treatment than training, less care than control. The true intent of this coffin practice remains shrouded in speculation. Some argue it was rooted in superstition, an echo of old-world rituals carried to New Orleans by immigrants who believed that mimicking death could trick illness into leaving the body. Others see it as a more sinister pursuit, an experiment in conditioning, a psychological trial to measure how humans behaved when forced to live at the threshold of death. The doctors who led the hospital, especially the enigmatic Dr. Marcelin Duray, were known to speak of threshold states, moments when the mind was most pliable, most open to influence. Lying in a coffin, surrounded by silence and fear, might have been their method of breaking patients down. The justification they offered in public was always thin, but delivered with confidence. They claimed their mortality rate was lower than that of competing institutions. They insisted patients left stronger, calmer, more obedient. To the desperate, such promises were enough. To the authorities, eager to show progress and reduce panic, those claims provided cover. Records of complaints were buried, families who protested were dismissed, and whispers of abuse were silenced. Yet evidence persisted in the shadows. Undertakers in the city began to notice anomalies. Bodies arrived with unusual marks, small incisions that had nothing to do with illness or treatment. Others were delivered sealed, the families forbidden from viewing them. When pressed, hospital officials offered vague explanations, blaming advanced disease or contagion, but suspicion spread quietly. Why would a hospital, supposedly saving lives, behave as though hiding the dead? The practice also left scars on those who survived. Many described recurring nightmares, waking in terror, convinced they were buried, alive. Others spoke of losing their sense of time, a feeling that days and nights blended into one long vigil inside the coffin. Some said the experience left them detached from the world, as though once they had rehearsed death, life itself became less real. The hospital's defenders argued that such trauma was the price of progress. They compared it to the painful experiments conducted in Europe, where physicians tested new theories of the mind and body in ways modern ethics would condemn. They dismissed suffering as collateral damage, necessary for the advancement of knowledge. But beneath the surface of rationalization, a darker pattern emerged. The patients selected for these coffin treatments were not the wealthy, not the influential. They were the poor, the immigrants, the ones whose families lacked the means to protest. They were, in effect, expendable. This was not medicine practiced on equal terms. It was exploitation disguised as healing, a theater of science played out on the bodies of those who could least resist. Rumors spread through the neighborhoods closest to the hospital. Some said the doctors were not simply studying death but communing with it, using the coffins as a ritual tool to harvest something from the boundary between life and the grave. Others whispered of secret gatherings late at night, where the doctors examined patients who no longer breathed but had not yet stiffened, their bodies treated less as corpses than as specimens. None of these stories were ever confirmed, but the fear they created was real. By the end of 1902, the hospital's reputation was already unraveling. Too many patients had vanished, too many families left without answers. Yet it remained open for several years, shielded by money and secrecy. Only when the fever epidemic waned and public pressure shifted to rebuilding the city's health system did the institution quietly shutter its doors. Its records were destroyed, its doctors disappeared, and its building eventually demolished. What lingers are fragments, memories passed through families, a handful of newspaper mentions, and the eerie recollections of those who survived lying in coffins while still alive. It is from these fragments that the truth must be pieced together. The hospital was not simply a place of healing. It was a stage upon which life and death blurred, and where the vulnerable were forced to face their own mortality not as an abstract fear, but as a daily suffocating reality. The origins of the hospital that would become infamous in 1902 New Orleans were tangled in secrecy from the very beginning. To most residents of the city, it appeared almost suddenly, as if conjured overnight on a quiet street at the edge of the French Quarter. Its brick facade bore no ornate designs, no welcoming arches like the charity hospitals of the era. Instead, its architecture was plain, stern, and almost forbidding, as though the building itself wished to discourage questions. Locals would later remark that it never looked like a place built for healing, but rather like something between a warehouse and a mausoleum. The story of its foundation traces back to a group of benefactors who called themselves the Society for the Advancement of Medical Truth. Their names appeared occasionally in print: wealthy merchants, lawyers, and at least one retired judge. Behind closed doors, however, their identities blurred into rumor. The society claimed their purpose was philanthropic, a response to the epidemics that had crippled the city throughout the 19th century. They argued that New Orleans needed a facility willing to experiment boldly to move beyond the limitations of traditional charity hospitals. They promised innovation, modern practices, and results that would outshine the cautious routines of older institutions. Yet the more one studies the paper trail, the stranger it becomes. The official charter for the hospital listed only 2 physicians, both of whom had studied briefly in Paris and Berlin, where radical ideas about the body and mind were circulating at the time. Their names appear again in private correspondences, letters, that speak of threshold experiments and the pursuit of knowledge at the boundary of the living state. These were not the words of ordinary doctors seeking to cure fever or mend broken bones. These were the words of men consumed by the fascination of death itself. Funding for the hospital arrived in sudden waves. Large sums of money were donated, anonymously, funneled through shell organizations that left no clear record of their original source. Some believed the Catholic Church had quietly supported the project, eager to quell the spread of Protestant-controlled institutions in the city. Others whispered that fraternal orders, perhaps even secret societies, had an interest in a place where the mysteries of life and death could be studied without interference. Whatever the truth, the money flowed steadily enough to allow the hospital to be built, staffed, and supplied with equipment that surpassed what most public clinics possessed. But while its exterior looked functional, even respectable, the interior was anything but ordinary. Survivors described corridors lined not with rows of beds but with alcoves, each designed to hold a single coffin. Wooden boxes were stacked and stored in advance, as though the building itself anticipated a constant demand for them. A few rooms resembled ordinary wards, but they were rarely used. Nurses and attendants were instructed to direct new patients toward the coffin chambers, where the real work of the hospital took place. When questioned about these practices, the founders responded with carefully rehearsed language. They insisted the coffin treatment was not morbid but practical. Beds, they argued, carried disease, breeding infection in their mattresses and frames. Wooden coffins, by contrast, could be disinfected, replaced cheaply, and aligned with the body's natural form. In pamphlets distributed to the public, they claimed this method prevented the spread of contagion and improved recovery rates. To the untrained eye, it sounded plausible. In a city accustomed to death and desperate for solutions, many were willing to believe. Yet not everyone was convinced. Competing doctors ridiculed the hospital, calling it a grotesque experiment that had no basis in science. Some priests denounced it from the pulpit, warning that it desecrated the dignity of the living by treating them as corpses. But these criticisms were easily drowned out by the hospital's defenders, who wielded both wealth and influence. Patients kept arriving, either through desperation or coercion. Families with no money for private care found themselves with no choice but to accept whatever treatment was offered. And so the hospital filled its coffins, day after day, under the banner of innovation. What is most unsettling about the institution's origin is the way it seemed designed not just for medical work but for observation, even ritual. Witnesses described balconies where doctors could watch patients below, noting their movements, their reactions to confinement, their struggles against fear. The chambers were dimly lit, with high windows that allowed in little natural light. At night, the flicker of lanterns cast long shadows that made the coffins appear less like beds and more like graves. Patients spoke of feeling as though they had been buried alive in a communal tomb, forced to endure their illness surrounded by the groans of others rehearsing their own deaths. The staff itself was carefully chosen. Nurses were recruited from poor families, sworn to silence with the promise of steady wages. They wore plain uniforms, their faces hidden beneath white veils that gave them the appearance of mourners rather than caretakers. Their orders were strict. No conversation with patients beyond the essentials, no expressions of sympathy, no interference with the doctor's methods. In effect, they became functionaries of silence, their presence reinforcing the atmosphere of control. As the hospital's reputation spread, rumors flourished outside its walls. Some claimed it was not truly a place of healing at all, but a front for darker pursuits. There were whispers of midnight deliveries, wagons arriving at the back entrance with crates that contained not supplies but bodies. Neighbors spoke of strange chanting heard on stormy nights, of lanterns glowing in the windows until dawn. These rumors could never be proven, yet they fed the growing unease that surrounded the hospital. The true origins of its philosophy remain debated. Some link it to the ideas of European mesmerists who believed the body could be manipulated by immersing it in states of near death. Others point to spiritualist movements popular in the late 19th century, which blurred the line between medical science and ritual. Still others see the hand of secret societies, eager to explore the mysteries of mortality under the cover of medicine. What is certain is that the hospital's foundation was never simply about curing disease. It was about control of the body, of the mind, and perhaps of the very boundary between life and death. By the time the hospital opened its doors, New Orleans was already primed to accept it. Epidemics had ravaged the city for decades, leaving citizens desperate for any institution that promised a solution. Poverty left many with no alternative, and fear silenced those who might otherwise have protested. Into this atmosphere of desperation, the hospital introduced its coffin treatment, and once it began, there was no turning back. What began as an experiment soon became routine, and what was routine soon became accepted, at least on the surface. Patients continued to enter, often with little knowledge of what awaited them. Families signed papers that surrendered their loved ones to the institution, trusting that it would deliver what it promised. And as the coffins filled, the hospital's true origins, its shadowy funding, its hidden philosophies, its eerie design, faded into the background, buried beneath the very silence it demanded from those within its walls. New Orleans in 1902 was a city that could never quite escape its contradictions. By day, it glittered with the sound of brass bands, the smell of chicory coffee, and the color of parades marching down narrow streets. By night, it sank into something darker, alleys where disease crept, where the poor lay abandoned in sagging wooden houses, and where whispers of the supernatural still clung to every corner. To understand why a hospital could place its patients in coffins and still be tolerated, one must first understand the social fabric of that time and place. The city was still haunted by epidemics. The yellow fever that had devastated earlier decades lingered in memory like a scar that never healed. Families remembered entire neighborhoods emptied in a matter of weeks, hearses moving in procession as though death had taken permanent residence. Though the fever had lessened by the turn of the century, fear remained deeply ingrained. New Orleans was also a city where poverty defined much of daily life. Immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Germany crowded into tenements, while African-American families, still struggling in the aftermath of Reconstruction, lived under constant oppression. Medical care was not a guarantee, but a luxury, often out of reach for the working poor. In such a climate, any institution that claimed to offer help could present itself as salvation, no matter how unorthodox its methods. Yet it was not only poverty and disease that shaped the atmosphere. New Orleans was steeped in superstition, folklore, and ritual, a place where Catholic traditions intertwined with African and Caribbean spiritual practices, and where belief in unseen forces was woven into everyday life. Death was not hidden away. It was ever present. Coffins were a familiar sight, paraded through streets in funeral processions accompanied by music that blurred the line between mourning and celebration. Cemeteries stood above ground, their tombs rising like miniature cities of the dead, reminders that burial in marshy soil was impossible. To live in New Orleans was to live alongside death, never far from its shadow. This cultural familiarity with mortality made the hospital's strange practices easier to conceal. When people heard that patients were placed in coffins, some did not recoil in horror, but rationalized it as a ritualistic extension of their own customs. If the dead were honored so publicly, perhaps the living could be healed by sharing in that same posture. In a city where funerals could resemble festivals, the line between bed and coffin was thinner than elsewhere. What might have been unthinkable in Boston or Chicago seemed, in New Orleans, merely another eccentricity of a city already known for its peculiarities. The superstition surrounding illness also played a role. Many believed that fever was not simply a disease but a spiritual affliction, a curse that could be lifted only through symbolic acts. Families told stories of ancestors who had recovered after sleeping in burial clothes or lying in positions, that mimicked the dead. The hospital's doctors exploited these beliefs, presenting their coffin treatment as an echo of folk wisdom dressed in medical language. They spoke of aligning the body with the rhythm of nature, of tricking death into passing by those who had already assumed its posture. To the fearful and the desperate, such explanations were compelling. Meanwhile, the city's authorities were more concerned with appearances than realities. They needed to demonstrate progress, to reassure the public that steps were being taken to prevent new epidemics. The hospital, with its claims of innovative methods and reduced mortality, gave them something to point to, even if they never looked too closely. Official reports were scarce, and when questions arose, they were answered with statistics that seemed impossible to verify. In truth, the city was content to let the hospital operate in silence as long as it kept panic at bay. The cultural backdrop also included a fascination with the occult. At the turn of the century, spiritualism was thriving across America, and New Orleans was no exception. Seances were held in private parlors, mediums advertised their services in the papers, and societies met to discuss the mysteries of life after death. In this environment, a hospital experimenting with the threshold between living and dying did not appear as an aberration, but as part of a larger curiosity that permeated the city. People wanted answers about what lay beyond, and some were willing to accept that doctors might find those answers by pushing their patients closer to that edge. But beneath the veneer of acceptance, fear simmered. Neighbors who lived near the hospital reported the constant arrival of wagons, not only bringing in patients but carrying out sealed coffins. The building's windows remained shuttered, its halls lit by lanterns even at midday, as though daylight itself was unwelcome. Families who sent loved ones there often never saw them again. Their bodies returned without explanation, or not returned at all. Yet few dared to speak openly, for to accuse the hospital was to risk drawing attention from the same powers that shielded it. In a city where influence was bought and sold, the poor knew better than to challenge the wealthy patrons behind the institution. For the patients themselves, the cultural atmosphere was suffocating. Many entered the hospital already resigned to death, convinced that their sickness was a curse no medicine could cure. When they were placed in coffins, some accepted it as natural, a final preparation for the inevitable. Others resisted, but their protests were met with the cold logic of doctors who insisted that such treatment was necessary. And so they lay there, suspended between resignation and terror, unsure whether they were being healed or buried alive. This uneasy mixture of desperation, superstition, and silence created the perfect conditions for the hospital to thrive. In another city, its methods might have been condemned immediately. In New Orleans, they became another secret folded into the city's long history of mysteries. The people, conditioned by generations of epidemic and loss, tolerated what might otherwise have been intolerable. The wealthy saw opportunity in the experimentation, the poor saw no alternative, and the culture of death that saturated the city made the bizarre seem plausible. To walk the streets of New Orleans in 1902 was to walk between worlds, the joyous rhythms of life and the constant presence of the grave. It was a place where a coffin could be a symbol of mourning, a vessel of ritual, and in the hands of certain doctors, a tool of supposed healing. In such a city, the hospital's methods did not immediately spark outrage. Instead, they blended into the atmosphere, hidden in plain sight. Another dark story whispered beneath the brass and laughter, waiting for those willing to look closer. The whispers began almost as soon as the first patients entered the strange new hospital. In neighborhoods surrounding the French Quarter, people noticed the quiet way wagons came and went, often at odd hours, carrying not just the sick but also closed coffins that seemed too heavy to contain the weak bodies of the dying. Families spoke in hushed voices, uncertain of what they had allowed their loved ones to walk into. And from behind the sealed doors of the wards, fragments of testimony slipped out, accounts from those who managed to leave alive or from nurses who could no longer bear their silence. These testimonies would become the most chilling evidence of what happened inside. One such account came from a dock worker named Emile, who fell ill with fever after unloading cargo in the damp, rat-infested wharves. His family had no money for private care, and the charity hospitals were overcrowded. The Coffin Hospital, as it was already called in whispers, offered to admit him immediately. Emile later recalled the moment he entered his assigned chamber. Instead of a bed, 2 attendants guided him into a narrow wooden box lined with stiff cloth. At first, he thought it was a mistake, a grim misunderstanding. But when he tried to rise, a doctor placed a hand on his chest and told him firmly, "You will heal here. The coffin holds the body as it was meant to rest." The sensation of lying there haunted him for years. He described the hollow echo of every breath, the faint groan of the wood beneath his shifting weight, the way shadows from the lanterns made the lid above him seem as though it would descend at any moment. What unsettled him most was the sound of the others. In the stillness of the ward, he heard scratching, whispering, even muffled cries from neighboring coffins. Some begged for release, others prayed aloud. Nurses did nothing. Their faces were veiled, their voices clipped to short commands, and their movements eerily quiet. Another testimony surfaced from a seamstress named Marguerite. She had entered the hospital suffering from what she thought was pneumonia. When she awoke from her fever, she realized she was confined in a coffin with a narrow slit at the top to allow air. The doctor who checked on her spoke of discipline, of keeping still to encourage the lungs to rest. She remembered how the staff would tap lightly on the lid during their rounds, as though testing whether she remained compliant. On nights, when patients cried out, she claimed, the sound of footsteps followed, and those cries were quickly silenced. In the morning, 1 or 2 coffins would be gone, their occupants never seen again. A nurse who fled the hospital in 1903 left behind, perhaps the most unsettling description. She wrote that doctors referred to certain patients as subjects rather than patients, marking them for observation. Those chosen were placed in coffins with lids partially closed, forcing them to endure hours in near darkness. Small openings allowed the doctors to watch, studying how long it took for panic to overtake the confined. She described how opiates were administered not as medicine, but as punishment for disobedience, dulling the senses of anyone who resisted. They wanted silence, she wrote. Not healing, not comfort. Silence. The nurse also claimed that certain experiments involved ritual-like practices. She remembered being ordered to stand in a chamber at midnight, holding a lantern while doctors circled the coffins, whispering in French and Latin. They pressed their hands against the lids, murmuring about the threshold between life and death. Patients inside moaned weakly, and yet the doctors carried on as though the suffering were part of a ceremony. The nurse admitted she could never understand the full meaning of what she witnessed, but the memory of the chants never left her. Local undertakers, too, began to speak in cautious tones. One reported receiving bodies from the hospital that bore unusual incisions, cuts along the arms and chest that had no relation to the illnesses listed on the certificates. Another noted that the coffins often arrived sealed, the families forbidden from viewing their loved ones. When one grieving mother demanded to see her son, the undertaker reluctantly opened the lid, only to find the boy's mouth sewn shut. The family was told it was a precaution against contagion, but the explanation rang hollow. Rumors spread through the poorer districts. Some said the hospital was harvesting organs, selling them to medical schools in Europe. Others believed the doctors were part of a secret fraternity seeking to learn how the soul departed the body, using the coffins as instruments to trap the living on the edge of death. Stories grew darker with each retelling. Patients buried alive. Beneath the floorboards, cries echoing through the pipes. Strange lights glowing from the windows during storms. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories captured the terror that hung over the institution. Even those who left the hospital alive were often broken by the experience. Survivors spoke of recurring nightmares, of waking with the suffocating certainty that they were still inside the coffin. Some could not sleep unless the lights were left burning, terrified of the dark silence they had endured. Others became withdrawn, convinced that death had already claimed a part of them in that ward. Their families described them as shadows of their former selves, men and women who had stared too long at the grave and never fully returned. And yet, despite these accounts, little was done to stop the hospital. When complaints reached the city, authorities, they were dismissed as hysteria or superstition. Families without influence were ignored. Those with connections were placated with vague assurances that the methods were experimental but effective. Newspapers printed only what officials allowed, often framing the hospital as a bold experiment in modern medicine. The testimonies that contradicted this narrative were buried as quickly as the bodies themselves. The most damning whispers came from within the hospital's own staff. A few attendants, speaking only after they had fled the city, described a growing obsession among the doctors. What had begun as a supposed treatment for fever seemed to evolve into something more unhinged. They noted how Dr. Duray and his colleagues spoke less about medicine and more about conditioning, about training the human mind to face death without resistance. They seemed to believe that by forcing patients to live inside coffins, they could reshape human nature itself, creating beings who no longer feared the grave. This obsession, coupled with the silence imposed on staff and patients alike, gave rise to an atmosphere unlike any other hospital. It was less a place of care than a laboratory of dread. Every testimony, every rumor, every whisper pointed to the same truth. The patients were not being healed. They were being studied, controlled, and in many cases, erased. The hospital demanded silence, and those who broke it vanished. The testimonies that survive today do so only because a few escaped and risked everything to tell their story. For the rest, their voices were lost, buried beneath the weight of wooden lids and the silence of an institution that thrived on secrecy. The newspapers of 1902 New Orleans carried whispers that no editor dared to print in full. It began with the frightened testimony of families whose loved ones had entered a certain hospital on the edge of the city and never returned the same. They spoke of a practice so macabre that even the police hesitated to intervene, fearing both ridicule and the wrath of wealthy donors tied to the institution. The rumor was simple, yet unspeakable, that in this hospital the sick were not laid in beds at all, but in coffins. At first it was dismissed as hysteria. People claimed the relatives were exaggerating, caught up in fever dreams of grief. Yet, as weeks passed, patterns emerged. Men and women brought in with treatable injuries, left in funeral boxes. Survivors, the few who walked out, recounted feeling the wooden edges beneath their bodies, hearing the scraping of nails and hinges, realizing only too late what they were lying in. The idea was so grotesque that even those repeating the claims would pause, lowering their voices, as if afraid the walls themselves might overhear. Investigators sent by the parish found themselves caught between conflicting duties. To expose the hospital was to destabilize one of the few medical sanctuaries serving the poorest districts, a place where yellow fever, tuberculosis, and consumption had hollowed entire neighborhoods. But to ignore the claims meant permitting something unspeakable. The building itself did not help matters. Those who stepped inside described a smell not of antiseptic or herbs, but of damp wood and resin, as though the place itself had been built from a carpenter's workshop meant for burial craft. The corridors were narrow, lined with pale walls stained by humidity, with shadows that seemed to cling too long. Nurses hurried past without meeting the eyes of visitors, their footsteps hushed, their faces pale. Patients who were lucid whispered, of being measured in their sleep, of hearing the tap of hammers, of glimpsing black cloth folded in corners where sheets should have been. To understand how such a horror could be tolerated, one must look at the city itself in that era. New Orleans was no stranger to death. Epidemics were common, and funerals often more elaborate than weddings. The culture of the dead thrived alongside the living, with cemeteries rising like stone cities above the swamp. Coffins were as familiar a sight as carriages. To a population desensitized by constant loss, the notion of beds doubling as coffins may not have seemed entirely implausible. In fact, some suggested it was born of grim practicality. If most patients would not survive, why waste scarce resources? Better to place them where their final transition would be seamless. Others hinted at a darker logic, that wealthy benefactors profited from funeral contracts, supplying both the hospital's beds and the graves that awaited. The sick became commodities, their bodies part of a system that merged care with disposal. A nurse's diary, uncovered decades later, lent weight to the rumors. She wrote of her first day, when she was asked to assist a doctor in transferring a man with pneumonia. Expecting to adjust linens, she pulled back the sheet and recoiled at the varnished surface beneath. The doctor scolded her for hesitating. "It saves time," he muttered as though efficiency excused the violation. She confessed in her writing that she grew numb after weeks, guiding trembling hands to rest against polished wood, telling herself it was only temporary, though she knew in most cases it was not. The diary described how patients would beg not to be laid down, clinging to the frame of the door, pleading for a chair or even the floor instead. She recalled one woman's words, "If I lie there, I will not rise again." And too often she was right. The local authorities did make inquiries, but the hospital's board was well connected. They argued that coffins were not coffins, but wooden enclosures built to prevent infection spreading through shared bedding. They dressed the practice in the language of hygiene, citing fears of vermin, fleas, and contagion. Few dared to question further, for to accuse them outright risked lawsuits, ruin, and being branded as enemies of progress. Yet whispers spread that contracts were drawn up between the hospital and local undertakers, ensuring a steady stream of business. Whether true or not, the suspicion grew strong enough to shadow every burial that followed. Families began removing their sick from the hospital, preferring home remedies, herbs, or prayers to the fate that awaited inside. Priests and pastors warned their congregations against it, calling it a place where death was not only expected, but prepared in advance. A story circulated of a boy who entered with a broken leg and returned days later in a coffin. His parents told that infection had claimed him, but neighbors recalled seeing him through the window, pale yet alive, the day before he vanished. When they asked for explanation, none came. Records of patients disappeared, names were misfiled, and soon, the truth became impossible to separate from rumor. The atmosphere around the hospital grew charged with dread. People walking past at night swore they heard hammering from within, long after visiting hours, and saw black wagons rolling quietly from its gates. The gas lamps outside flickered as if reluctant to illuminate what passed there. The very air seemed to thicken, a mix of swamp humidity and something unspoken, a sense that the building itself had absorbed the sorrow of its occupants. Those who worked there rarely lasted long. Nurses resigned in tears, doctors left abruptly, yet new faces always replaced them. Outsiders, strangers, people who spoke little and seemed eager to avoid conversation. By the year's end, official reports claimed the hospital was modernizing, replacing outdated wooden fixtures with proper beds. Yet even then, the rumors never died. For decades afterward, old residents would lower their voices when the building was mentioned, warning children not to wander too close. The story of the coffin beds lingered, half legend, half memory, impossible to erase because it explained too well the unease people felt when remembering loved ones lost there. Even today, those researching the city's medical history stumble upon gaps where records should be, unexplained surges in mortality that statistics cannot account for, and whispers in archives that hint at something far darker than negligence. What began as a rumor became a shadow, one that clings to the city's past, a reminder that sometimes institutions meant to heal instead prepare us for burial long before we are ready. When the first journalists dared to question the strange reputation of the hospital, they encountered a wall of silence that was as thick and impenetrable as the humidity that clung to the streets of New Orleans. In 1902, a reporter from a local Gazette attempted to publish an article describing what families had been whispering for months, that their loved ones were being placed in coffins instead of beds. His editor cut the piece before it could reach the public, warning that the hospital was backed by men with deep pockets and deeper secrets. Behind closed doors, the paper received quiet threats: withdraw the accusations or risk losing advertisers, legal immunity, and public credibility. Even so, fragments of the truth bled through. A single line in the classifieds hinted at innovative bedding solutions for patient containment, while obituaries quietly noted that the deceased had already been at rest when delivered to the undertaker. These strange phrases planted seeds of suspicion, and ordinary citizens began to ask questions the city did not want to answer. The strangest aspect of the scandal was how deeply woven it became into everyday life. Undertakers, carpenters, and furniture makers seemed to profit from the arrangement, though few admitted it openly. There were whispers that carpenters were commissioned to build special containers, not quite coffins, not quite beds, but something in between. They were narrower than ordinary beds, with raised edges and wooden panels that gave the impression of containment rather than comfort. Families who managed to glimpse their relatives described the unnerving sight of bodies confined in spaces too small for freedom of movement, as though the sick had been reduced to cargo. To lie in such a structure was to accept death before it arrived. Patients who survived recalled hearing the creak of wood beneath them, the hollow echo of their own movements, the subtle vibration of nails straining against boards. Some said they would close their eyes at night, terrified they would awaken to find the lid shut above them. The more one looks at the social climate of New Orleans in that period, the more one sees how fear and death were almost commodified. The city was still haunted by outbreaks of yellow fever and cholera, diseases that had already claimed tens of thousands. Public confidence in hospitals was tenuous, for they were often overcrowded, underfunded, and rife with infection. The wealthy secured private care. The poor were left to public wards where medicine blended with ritual, science with superstition. In such a climate, the hospital's decision, or its alleged decision, to use coffins as beds may have reflected something darker than mere practicality. It suggested an institution that no longer saw the boundary between treatment and burial. To enter its halls was to begin the process of dying, even if one's body had not yet surrendered. One story, passed down in oral tradition, concerned a dock worker named Julian who injured his back unloading a shipment along the river. Unable to afford private care, his family brought him to the hospital. He was lucid, though in pain, and promised his children he would return within days. Instead, he vanished. Weeks later, neighbors attended his funeral, and the family swore he had been buried in the very box he had lain upon in the ward. Lidine, undertaker, admitted quietly that the hospital had delivered him already enclosed, sparing the family the cost of a coffin. To outsiders, it seemed efficient, even charitable, but for his children, the memory of their father's final days was poisoned by the knowledge that he had slept in his grave before his death. The authorities tried to explain away these accounts. They argued that wooden enclosures were necessary for sanitary reasons, that they prevented contagion by isolating patients. Yet critics pointed out that true isolation required space and ventilation, not confinement in boxes. What lingered beneath the surface was the suspicion of profit, that every coffin delivered was a transaction, every patient a guaranteed customer for funeral parlors with ties to the hospital board. This unspoken collusion transformed the sick into commodities. Their bodies moved seamlessly from ward to grave, bypassing dignity, bypassing hope. The hospital, rather than being a sanctuary of life, became the first stage of burial. Nurses, when interviewed decades later, spoke cautiously, often with tears. Some admitted they had left the profession entirely, unable to endure the sight of pleading eyes staring up from coffin-shaped beds. They described the psychological toll of lowering fragile bodies into wooden frames, knowing the symbolism was too strong to ignore. A few recalled patients who refused to lie down at all, preferring to collapse on the floor rather than enter what they called death's cradle. And yet, the nurses had no choice. Orders were strict. Dissent was punished with dismissal, and jobs were scarce for women at the time. Many silenced their consciences, convincing themselves it was a matter of hygiene, even as the truth ate at them from within. The hospital's layout itself fed the mystery. Visitors recalled corridors that narrowed unnaturally, forcing them to walk in single file, as though entering a crypt rather than a place of healing. Gas lamps flickered against walls that sweated moisture, their dim light casting elongated shadows that resembled coffins stacked against the plaster. The smell of varnish hung heavy, overpowering the faint traces of alcohol or herbs. Patients who were well enough to describe their surroundings noted the eerie quiet that settled at night. The usual hospital clamor, nurses' footsteps, doctors' chatter, the shuffle of patients, was replaced by hammering sounds from distant rooms, the unmistakable ring of nails driven into wood. No one dared to ask why such noises persisted after midnight. The public, caught between skepticism and dread, treated the hospital as a cursed place. Some families claimed that to send a loved one there was to sign their death certificate in advance. Priests began to warn congregations, framing it as a place where souls were prepared for burial before their bodies had given up. And yet, desperation still drove people to its doors. Poverty left few alternatives, and for many, it was either the coffin beds of the hospital or the slow agony of untreated disease at home. This paradox fueled the silence around the practice. To condemn the hospital outright was to strip the poor of their only lifeline, however corrupt it might have been. Historians today struggle to separate fact from legend, but what is clear is the deep unease the story left behind. Records from the hospital are incomplete, with admissions logged but deaths poorly documented. Undertaker ledgers show sudden spikes in deliveries coinciding with times of low reported outbreaks, suggesting something more systematic than epidemic necessity. The absence of detailed medical records makes the truth elusive, but silence itself tells a story. Institutions that hide their archives often have the most to conceal. Oral accounts from descendants of patients keep the story alive, their voices trembling as they describe the horror passed down like a family curse. What endures most powerfully is not the certainty of whether every patient lay in a coffin, but the cultural wound it inflicted. In a city where cemeteries rise above ground like marble neighborhoods, where death was already woven into the architecture, the hospital blurred the line further. It transformed treatment into ritual burial, illness into inevitability. Families remembered not just the loss of loved ones, but the indignity of knowing they slept in coffins while still breathing. That indignity echoes louder than statistics, louder than silence. It is the unease of a people forced to wonder whether their city had allowed commerce to eclipse compassion, whether the hospital built for healing had instead become the quietest mortuary of all. Even after the turn of the century, long after the hospital had supposedly abandoned its coffin beds, the whispers did not fade. In fact, they deepened, becoming a legend that clung to the city like the swamp fog rising from the bayou. Older generations would speak in hushed tones of what they saw, or thought they saw, inside its walls, while the younger ones inherited the dread without knowing why. By 1910, when reformers began to push for cleaner hospitals and stricter oversight, the building itself had already gained a reputation as cursed. Nurses transferred elsewhere as quickly as they could. Patients pleaded with their families not to take them there, and ministers would pray over the threshold before stepping inside. Even the doctors, though publicly dismissive of the rumors, seemed to carry a shadow in their eyes when the subject was raised. What haunted people most was not the certainty of what happened, but the ambiguity. Some claimed that the coffins were never real, that they were metaphors inflated by gossip and grief. Others insisted they had touched the varnished wood themselves, heard the nails being driven into lids in the dead of night, and seen bodies carried away already boxed. A strange duality emerged. The story could be both a lie and a truth at the same time, depending on who told it. This ambiguity made the hospital's reputation more dangerous than fact alone, because it allowed the horror to spread unchecked, filling gaps in memory with imagination far darker than reality might have been. As the years passed, the hospital's archives were picked apart by investigators and historians. Patient ledgers showed unusual gaps, entire months missing, while the city's undertaker records reflected suspiciously steady business even during times of low reported illness. Official explanations were offered: misplaced files, clerical errors, the common unpredictability of disease. But for families who lost loved ones there, no excuse could erase the sense that something deliberate had been hidden. They pointed to the way names were scratched out in registers, or replaced with initials, as if anonymity was safer for the institution than acknowledgement. The physical building added its own testimony. Long after it closed, those who dared to enter spoke of a suffocating stillness that seemed unnatural even for an abandoned ward. Sunlight barely penetrated the windows, and the rooms were lined with faint rectangular stains on the floor, too precise to be accidents. Some claimed they were the outlines of the wooden enclosures once set there, impressions left behind like shadows burned into the boards. The air smelled faintly of old varnish, as if the wood itself had rotted into the plaster. Those who lingered too long reported hearing faint knocks, like nails being tapped, reverberating from the walls. Paranormal investigators decades later would treat these stories as hauntings, but to those who remembered the original whispers, they were reminders that the dead had never been properly separated from the living. In the wider community, the eye scandal had long-lasting effects. For many years, the poor of New Orleans distrusted hospitals altogether, preferring home remedies, spiritual healers, or midwives. This resistance to medical institutions only deepened the city's struggles with outbreaks, as fear outweighed science. The legacy of the coffin beds, whether literal or symbolic, poisoned faith in medicine for generations. It created an invisible divide. The wealthy could afford clean, private care, while the poor carried the suspicion that institutions were less about healing and more about disposal. That suspicion lingered in folklore, passed down like a curse from parent to child, reminding them never to place blind trust in the halls of authority. Perhaps most chilling of all were the testimonies that emerged much later from descendants of those who worked there. Some nurses confessed to their grandchildren that they had seen the truth but stayed silent out of fear of losing their jobs, or because they were threatened by superiors who told them to speak is to bury your own career. Others admitted they tried to soften the cruelty, slipping pillows beneath patients' heads or placing flowers at their sides as if to disguise the wooden reality beneath them. A few carried guilt all their lives, unable to forget the pleading eyes of patients who begged not to be laid down. These private confessions, emerging in fragments across decades, carried more weight than any official record. They were raw, personal, and untainted by institutional denial. By the mid-20th century, the hospital had been demolished, but its reputation remained etched into the city's psyche. The land was repurposed, yet residents swore nothing prospered there. Businesses failed, structures decayed faster than elsewhere, and those who lived nearby reported nightmares of being trapped in wooden boxes, unable to breathe. Children dared each other to walk past the lot at night, claiming they could hear scratching from beneath the ground. Whether these stories were superstition or memory hardly mattered. They reinforced the sense that some places never cleanse themselves of the stains they acquire. The legend of the coffin beds also traveled beyond New Orleans, carried in sensationalist newspaper features, and whispered among travelers who sought to shock with tales of Southern grotesquerie. Writers painted the hospital as a symbol of corruption, greed, and death, weaving it into the city's long tradition of Gothic horror. For outsiders, it became another piece of the macabre mystique of New Orleans, a city where the line between life and death was thinner than anywhere else. For locals, though, it was no entertainment. It was a wound, a reminder of how easily desperation and poverty could strip people of dignity even before they died. What makes the story endure is the way it reflects a deeper human fear, not simply of death, but of being buried before one's time, of being treated as already gone while still breathing. The coffin bed was more than a piece of furniture. It was a symbol of abandonment, of institutions turning their backs on hope. It carried the suggestion that life itself could be dismissed as inconvenient, that once marked by illness or poverty, a person was no longer considered worth saving. That fear lingers universally, transcending time and place, which is why the story continues to haunt those who hear it. In the end, whether the coffins were literal or symbolic hardly matters. The impact on the community was real. The trauma passed through generations, and the silence of the authorities speaks louder than any denial. The hospital that treated patients with coffins instead of beds may no longer stand, but its shadow stretches across the history of New Orleans like a permanent scar, reminding us that sometimes the greatest horrors are not in what is proven, but in what is whispered, hidden, and left unresolved. If you've stayed with us through this dark journey into the forgotten hospital of New Orleans, you now carry a piece of history that most people were never meant to know. Stories like this are not just tales of the past, they are warnings about how easily truth can be buried, how human lives can be reduced to statistics, and how silence often protects the powerful while the vulnerable suffer. By uncovering these shadows, we make sure they are not lost, and that the voices of those who were silenced are finally heard. But this channel is more than storytelling. It's about building a community of seekers who refuse to look away from the unsettling corners of history. Every time you subscribe, you strengthen that community. Every time you comment, you add another voice to the conversation, reminding us that these stories matter and should never be forgotten. So if this story left you unsettled, shocked, or even questioning what else might still be hidden in the archives of history, I want to hear from you. What do you think truly happened inside that hospital? Was it practicality, corruption, or something far darker? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read each one, and many of your insights inspire future investigations. And if you want to continue uncovering the hidden, the forbidden, and the deeply unsettling, hit that subscribe button right now, because the next story might just change the way you see the past and yourself forever.